Perry Como reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn velvet box, his hands that had held a microphone through 3 decades of the gentlest and most reassuring voice in American music, trembling slightly as he opened it. A tremor that several people present later said felt genuinely jarring precisely because it contradicted every previous public appearance Como had ever made across his entire career. It was April 12, 1978, 11:46 p.m., NBC Studios in Burbank, and inside that box was not a piece of jewelry anyone in the audience expected. Coming up, what was actually inside that small velvet box? The specific night in 1938 when Perry Como came within a single phone call of throwing away the only marriage he ever wanted, and the 6 words his wife Roselle said to him that he carried, quite literally, close to his heart for the remaining decades of his life. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double-check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double-check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night. Because what almost nobody watching that broadcast understood was that the calmest and most reliably wholesome man in American entertainment had once come dangerously close to becoming exactly the kind of unfaithful celebrity husband that fame so often produced. Pierino Ronald Como was born in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania in 1912, the 7th of 13 children in a working-class Italian immigrant family, and he met Roselle Boline in 1929 when both of them were still teenagers in the same small Pennsylvania town. A courtship that developed with the specific and uncomplicated ease of 2 people who had known each other, in some sense, their entire lives before either of them fully understood what falling in love actually meant. They married in 1933 when Perry was 21 years old and still working as a barber, years before anyone, including Perry himself, had any indication that he possessed a singing voice that would eventually make him one of the most beloved and most commercially successful performers in the history of American popular music. The specific circumstances of their courtship deserve fuller documentation, because they illuminate exactly how uncomplicated and genuine the foundation of their relationship actually was before fame introduced any complexity into it. Perry and Roselle grew up within walking distance of each other in Canonsburg, attending the same church and the same community gatherings that structured small-town Pennsylvania life during the 1920s, a shared childhood context that meant neither of them ever experienced the specific uncertainty of courting someone whose true character remained largely unknown. Roselle's own family, like Como's, were Italian immigrants who had settled in the same close-knit community, and their eventual marriage was celebrated by both families as the natural culmination of a friendship and courtship that had unfolded gradually and visibly over several years, witnessed by an entire community that had watched both of them grow from childhood into young adulthood. This specific foundation, built entirely before either of them had any reason to imagine the considerable fame that would eventually complicate their marriage, gave both Perry and Roselle a shared understanding of who the other person actually was beneath any subsequent public persona, an understanding that would prove, according to people who knew them well, essential to surviving the specific test that Perry's sudden fame would eventually introduce into their relationship. What almost nobody in the American public fully understood, across 4 decades of watching Perry Como project an image of effortless, wholesome reliability on television screens across the country, was the specific and genuinely difficult test that his marriage endured during the earliest and most disorienting years of his rising fame. A test that very nearly ended in the exact kind of infidelity that had destroyed so many other marriages among performers who found themselves suddenly and overwhelmingly famous. Perry Como's transition from working barber to nationally recognized singing sensation happened with a speed that left him, by his own later admission, genuinely unprepared for the specific temptations that sudden fame introduced into what had previously been an uncomplicated small-town marriage. Como had been discovered almost by accident, singing while cutting hair in his small Canonsburg barbershop, when a visiting band leader happened to hear his voice and encouraged him to audition for a professional touring orchestra, a specific and improbable turn of fortune that transformed Como's entire life within the space of a few short years. By the late 1930s, he had joined Ted Weems's popular touring orchestra as a featured vocalist, a position that placed him almost overnight in front of audiences considerably larger and considerably more enthusiastic than anything his previous life in Canonsburg had prepared him to navigate. The specific disorientation of this transition, from anonymous small-town barber to increasingly recognized performer receiving genuine public adoration, produced in Como, by his own later account, a kind of psychological vertigo that he had never anticipated and that very few people in his previous life could have helped him prepare for, given that nobody he knew personally had ever experienced anything remotely similar. The specific texture of this challenge deserves fuller understanding, because it explains exactly what almost happened on a particular night in 1938 that Perry Como would carry as a private and permanent turning point for the remainder of his life. By 1938, Como was touring extensively with Ted Weems's orchestra, performing in cities across the country to audiences that included considerable numbers of young women whose attention, according to accounts given by band members who toured with him during this period, presented a specific and constant temptation that many performers of that era, and many decades since, ultimately failed to resist. Como himself later described this period, in one of his rare, candid interviews about his personal life, as the most genuinely difficult test of character he ever faced, considerably more challenging, in his own private assessment, than any professional obstacle his career subsequently presented him with. He described, in this same rare interview, the specific and disorienting quality of touring life during this period, weeks and sometimes months away from his young family, staying in unfamiliar hotels in unfamiliar cities, surrounded constantly by the particular attention that a rising musical star inevitably attracted. He said that the band members who toured alongside him, many considerably less committed to their own marriages and relationships, treated the specific temptations of touring life as an accepted and unremarkable feature of their profession, a normalized culture that made resisting those same temptations considerably more difficult than it might have been in a more supportive or more accountable environment. Como said that he sometimes felt during this period like the only person in his professional circle who still believed that fidelity required active defense rather than simply happening automatically, a specific isolation that made the eventual crisis of 1938 considerably more dangerous than it might have been with better support from the people around him. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment. Because what happens on that stage in a few minutes reveals something about one of America's most beloved and most genuinely wholesome performers that almost nobody ever fully understood. According to an account Como eventually gave to exactly one close friend, decades after the actual events, there was a specific evening in the autumn of 1938, during an extended tour stop in a city he never publicly identified, when he found himself genuinely and seriously considering an infidelity that would have, in his own later assessment, fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of his marriage and his character. A specific woman whose identity Como never revealed even in his most candid later reflections, had made her interest in him unmistakably clear, and Como, isolated from Roselle by the considerable distance and duration of the tour, found himself for the only time in his entire life, according to what he later confided, genuinely and seriously tempted to act on an attraction that had nothing to do with his actual feelings for his wife and everything to do with the specific and overwhelming novelty of sudden fame's easy access to attention he had never previously experienced. Como described making a specific decision that evening that he credited, for the remainder of his life, with saving his marriage and fundamentally shaping the man he ultimately became. Rather than acting on the temptation directly in front of him, he called Roselle from a hotel telephone, a call he later admitted he made specifically because some part of him understood that hearing her actual voice, rather than simply thinking about her in the abstract, represented his only reliable defense against a decision he already sensed he was on the verge of making. He did not tell her in that specific call about the temptation he was facing. He simply talked with her about ordinary domestic matters, about their young son, about the small details of daily life that had nothing directly to do with the crisis he was privately navigating. The specific content of that conversation, according to what Como eventually described, unfolded with the same ordinary warmth that had characterized their communication throughout their entire marriage. Roselle describing a minor domestic difficulty with their young son's schooling, Como listening and offering the kind of practical, engaged suggestions that revealed, in retrospect, exactly how genuinely present he remained in the daily texture of his family's life despite the physical distance the tour had introduced. This ordinariness, Como later reflected, was precisely what made the conversation so unexpectedly powerful. The specific and unglamorous reality of his actual marriage standing in stark and immediate contrast to the exciting but ultimately hollow temptation he had been considering only minutes earlier. A contrast that required no dramatic confrontation or emotional declaration to become completely clear to him. According to Como's own later account, it was Roselle's voice itself, rather than anything specific either of them said during that call, that ultimately resolved his crisis. A specific quality of familiar warmth in her tone that reached him in a way that no amount of private moral reasoning had managed to accomplish in the preceding hours of internal deliberation. This detail carries particular significance when examined against the specific psychological research on temptation and commitment that later scholars of relationship psychology have conducted. Research that consistently identifies exactly the kind of tangible, sensory reconnection Como instinctively sought, hearing an actual voice rather than simply thinking abstractly about a relationship, as one of the most reliably effective interventions against exactly the kind of momentary temptation he was experiencing. Como, of course, had no access to any of this later psychological research when he made his decision to call Roselle that evening in 1938, acting instead on what he later described simply as an instinct he did not fully understand at the time, but that he trusted completely in the moment it mattered most. He described hearing, in the ordinary warmth and familiarity of her voice, a specific and complete recognition of exactly what he stood to lose, a clarity that no amount of abstract reasoning about fidelity and commitment had managed to produce before he actually heard her speaking. He ended the call according to his account. Having made his decision, and he left the hotel that same evening rather than remaining in a situation he no longer trusted himself to navigate safely, walking for hours through an unfamiliar city until the specific temptation that had nearly overwhelmed him finally fully passed. Como described this walk decades later in considerable and vivid detail, an extended period of solitary reflection through streets he did not recognize, in a city whose name he never publicly disclosed, during which he found himself confronting, with a directness he had never previously allowed himself, exactly what kind of husband and exactly what kind of man he actually wanted to become. He said that by the time he finally returned to his hotel, several hours later, something had genuinely settled in him. A clarity about his own values and his own priorities that felt, in retrospect, considerably more solid and more permanent than the momentary temptation that had nearly overwhelmed him only hours earlier. This walk, more than any single dramatic realization, represented for Como the actual turning point of the entire crisis, a slow and deliberate process of self-examination rather than any single sudden epiphany. He never told Roselle directly what had almost happened that night, believing, according to what he confided to his one close friend decades later, that the specific and considerable pain such a confession would cause her outweighed whatever relief confessing might have provided him personally. This decision itself deserves careful consideration because it reveals something significant about the specific ethical framework Como carried into the remainder of his marriage. He believed, according to his own later reflection, that confessing a temptation he had ultimately resisted would place an unfair emotional burden on his wife, forcing her to manage feelings of hurt and suspicion about something that had never actually occurred, when the more genuinely loving choice was simply to ensure, through his own private and permanent discipline, that nothing resembling that evening's crisis would ever occur again. Whether this reasoning represented genuine wisdom or a more convenient form of self-protection is a question Como himself apparently wrestled with privately across the following decades, though his sustained fidelity for the remainder of his 65-year marriage suggests that whatever his reasoning, the underlying commitment it produced proved genuinely durable. But he carried the experience as a permanent private turning point, a moment that crystallized, for him, exactly what his marriage actually meant and exactly what he was and was not willing to risk in exchange for the specific temptations that his sudden and overwhelming fame had introduced into his previously uncomplicated life. From that evening forward, according to people who knew him across the following decades, Perry Como maintained a specific and unwavering discipline about the boundaries he permitted himself during his considerable years of touring and public performance, a discipline that colleagues and biographers alike eventually cited as one of the most genuinely remarkable examples of sustained marital fidelity in an industry not generally known for it. Band members and later television colleagues who worked with him across subsequent decades consistently described specific and deliberate boundaries Como maintained, declining private meetings with female admirers that other performers routinely accepted, and maintaining throughout his entire subsequent career a reputation for genuine and uncomplicated fidelity that became, in itself, part of the broader public trust that made him one of America's most beloved entertainers. Johnny Carson had booked Perry Como for that evening's broadcast to discuss his considerable and continuing career success, an appearance built entirely around warm reflection on one of the most consistently beloved musical careers in American entertainment history. Carson himself had a genuine personal fondness for Como that extended across many years of professional association, having interviewed him on numerous previous occasions and having consistently found him one of the most genuinely relaxed and consistently pleasant guests the show ever hosted, a performer whose public reputation for effortless calm Carson privately understood, based on decades of professional observation, to be an unusually accurate reflection of Como's actual private temperament rather than a constructed public persona. This general impression of Como as someone whose public and private selves aligned closely made what happened during that particular broadcast considerably more surprising to Carson than it might have been with a guest whose public image he already understood to be more carefully managed. Nobody on the production staff had any indication that the broadcast would turn toward anything resembling the private crisis Como had navigated 4 decades earlier. The broadcast began exactly as anticipated. Como discussing his current projects and reflecting warmly on his considerable career with the same easy, reassuring charm that had defined his public persona for decades. Both Carson and the studio audience settling into the comfortable and familiar rhythm that Como's appearances reliably produced across his many previous visits to that stage. Roughly 18 minutes into the broadcast, Carson, attempting to generate an interesting personal reflection, asked Como what he believed was the actual secret behind a marriage that had, by that point, lasted an extraordinary 45 years in an industry that made lasting marriages genuinely rare. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Perry Como was quiet for a long moment, and several people present described a specific shift in his expression, the easy, practiced charm that had defined the broadcast's opening minutes, giving way to something considerably more inward and reflective. He said that he had never told this particular story publicly, and that he was not entirely certain, even in the moment of beginning to speak, why he had decided that this particular evening felt like the right time to finally tell it. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small worn velvet box, holding it for a moment without opening it, the studio growing quiet as the audience sensed. With the specific attentiveness that builds when a beloved performer's careful public composure begins to shift into something more genuine, he opened the box. Inside was not a piece of jewelry, as several audience members later admitted they had expected. It was a small folded piece of paper, worn soft with age and decades of careful handling. A receipt from a Pennsylvania hotel dated October of 1938. The only physical artifact Como had kept from the night he had nearly destroyed his marriage before it had properly begun. He explained, for the first time in any public setting, the specific crisis of that evening, the temptation he had faced, and the phone call to Roselle that had ultimately resolved it. He said that he had kept that receipt for 40 years, not as a memento of anything he was proud of, but as a specific and permanent reminder of exactly how close he had come to becoming a considerably different man than the one his audiences had come to know and trust. He described, in considerable detail, the specific ritual he had developed around this object over the following decades, transferring it carefully between jackets whenever his wardrobe changed, checking, almost unconsciously, for its presence in his pocket before important performances or public appearances, a small private habit that had become so automatic across 40 years that he said he sometimes forgot the specific origin of the compulsion until he deliberately paused to remember why the habit had originally begun. He said that touching the folded paper through the fabric of his jacket had become, over the decades, a kind of private anchor, a physical reminder available to him at any moment of exactly what genuine commitment had actually required of him, and exactly what he stood to lose if he ever allowed himself to forget that requirement. He said that he carried it, quite literally, in whatever jacket he happened to be wearing on any given day, a physical and constant reminder of the specific commitment he had made to himself that night in 1938, a commitment he said he had never once seriously reconsidered again across the following 4 decades. Johnny Carson, listening to this account with genuine and evident emotion, asked Como whether Roselle knew he still carried that receipt. Como said that she did not, that this was, in fact, the first time he had ever discussed the receipt's existence with anyone outside the single close friend he had confided in decades earlier, and that he was not entirely certain how his wife would respond to learning about it, given that revealing the receipt necessarily meant revealing the crisis it commemorated. The studio audience, 300 people who had come expecting warm, nostalgic musical reminiscence, sat in a silence that several people present described as the most complete and most genuinely moved silence they experienced at a live television taping, watching one of America's most reliably wholesome performers reveal, for the first time in public, the specific and genuine test his marriage had survived, and the private discipline that had sustained it across 4 remarkable decades. Several audience members, interviewed by entertainment reporters in the days following the broadcast, described the specific and unexpected power of learning that Como's famously calm and reassuring public persona had actually required considerable private effort to maintain, rather than simply reflecting an inherently untroubled temperament. One audience member, a woman who had been married for over 30 years, told a reporter that she found herself unexpectedly moved to tears, explaining that she had always privately worried that her own marriage's occasional difficulties reflected some personal failing on her part, and that hearing Perry Como describe the genuine effort his own, famously stable marriage had required gave her a considerably more realistic and considerably more forgiving framework for understanding her own relationship's ordinary challenges. What followed was a considerably longer and more genuinely candid conversation than either the audience or the production staff had anticipated. Como discussing, with an openness he had never displayed publicly before, the specific and ongoing effort that sustaining a genuinely faithful marriage within the entertainment industry had actually required, effort that his careful public image of effortless, wholesome reliability had never fully revealed to audiences who had simply assumed his fidelity came naturally, rather than through sustained, deliberate choice. He spoke about the numerous smaller and less dramatic temptations that had presented themselves across the following decades, moments considerably less intense than the 1938 crisis, but that had nonetheless required the same underlying discipline to navigate successfully. Evidence that maintaining genuine fidelity across an entire career and an entire lifetime required not a single dramatic decision, but an accumulated series of smaller, consistent choices made repeatedly across many years. The broadcast ran significantly over its scheduled time, NBC making no attempt to cut away from what had become one of the most unexpectedly candid, unscripted moments in the program's history. NBC's switchboard, according to production staff who monitored it, received an overwhelming volume of calls in the days following the broadcast. Viewers writing and calling specifically to describe how deeply moved they had been watching Perry Como reveal the genuine effort underlying a public image of easy, natural fidelity that audiences had simply taken for granted for decades. Several of these callers specifically mentioned their own marriages, describing a particular resonance in learning that even the most seemingly natural and effortless commitment often concealed genuine private struggle and deliberate, ongoing choice rather than simple inherent virtue. One caller, a man who had recently confessed his own infidelity to his wife and was struggling with the specific guilt and uncertainty that followed such a disclosure, told a production staff member that watching Como describe the temptation he had faced and the deliberate choice he had made to resist it had given him a considerably clearer understanding of exactly what he needed to rebuild in his own marriage going forward. A specific and sustained discipline, rather than simply a one-time apology, followed by an assumption that trust would naturally restore itself over time. This response, echoed across the substantial volume of calls and letters NBC received in the following weeks, suggested that what had happened on that stage had touched something considerably larger than the specific story of one beloved performer's private history. A broader recognition among American viewers of exactly what genuine fidelity actually required, sustained and deliberate choice rather than simple inherent character. Roselle Como, according to accounts given by their children years later, learned about the receipt and the story behind it only after watching that broadcast, and rather than the difficult reaction Perry had privately feared, she reportedly told him, quietly, that she had always known something significant had happened during that particular tour. Sensing in his behavior in the weeks following his return home a specific and unusual attentiveness that she had never fully understood the origin of until watching him explain it, decades later, on national television. According to their daughter's later recollection, Roselle described watching the broadcast from their home with a specific and complicated mixture of emotions, initial surprise giving way within minutes to a quiet and considerable relief at finally understanding a mystery she had privately carried for 4 decades without ever directly confronting her husband about it. She told her children in the days following the broadcast that she had always sensed something had shifted in Perry during that particular period of touring. A specific deepening of his attention to their marriage and their family that she had noticed without ever understanding its precise origin, and that learning the actual explanation, however difficult the underlying story, ultimately deepened her understanding of exactly how seriously her husband had taken their commitment to each other across the entirety of their marriage. Perry Como and Roselle remained married until her death in 1998, 65 years after their wedding, one of the longest and most genuinely stable marriages in the history of American entertainment. A marriage that survived not through the absence of genuine temptation, but through the presence of deliberate, sustained, and repeatedly renewed commitment. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood, something that connects the entire arc of the Comos' marriage back to what happened on that Tonight Show stage. In the years following the broadcast, according to their children, Perry began speaking more openly, within the family, about the specific effort that sustaining a genuinely faithful marriage within the entertainment industry had actually required. Conversations that his own children said gave them a considerably more realistic and considerably more useful framework for their own subsequent relationships than the simple assumption that good marriages simply happened naturally to people with sufficiently good character. Their son, in a later interview reflecting on his parents' extraordinary 65-year marriage, specifically credited that Tonight Show broadcast with changing how his entire family understood commitment, transforming it from an abstract virtue they had simply assumed their father possessed into a concrete and specific practice that required, as Perry himself had demonstrated, active and sustained choice, sometimes made in a single difficult moment that determined the entire subsequent trajectory of everything that followed. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the private disciplines and private choices that sustain the relationships in your own life, choices that may look effortless from the outside, but that often require considerably more ongoing commitment than anyone observing from a distance ever fully appreciates. If this story moved you, Share it with someone who needs to hear that genuine fidelity is built through deliberate choice rather than simple natural inclination. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the private disciplines behind America's most beloved public figures. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and telling me about a moment in your own life when you chose commitment over temptation.